My wife Monica had never paid for a single meal in the 7 years we had been together. A pattern that started on our first date at a seafood restaurant in downtown Seattle and continued through our entire relationship and 4 years of marriage. I was a software developer at a mid-sized tech company in South Lake Union, making $95,000 annually, while Monica worked as a project coordinator at a marketing agency in Capitol Hill, earning about $58,000 a year. Every time we went out to eat, whether it was casual lunch at Pike Place Market or nice dinners in Belltown or drinks with friends in Fremont, the bill always came to our table and sat there until I reached for it, with Monica never once offering to split the cost or suggesting we take turns paying. At first I told myself it was just traditional dating dynamics and that once we were more established as a couple, we would naturally move to a more equitable arrangement. But years passed and the pattern never changed, with Monica always conveniently checking her phone or excusing herself to the restroom when the bill arrived, leaving me to handle payment while she waited for me to finish the transaction. The financial imbalance extended far beyond just restaurant meals into virtually every aspect of our shared life together in our Capitol Hill apartment that I paid for entirely. I covered rent on our 2-bedroom place that cost $2,400 monthly, while Monica contributed nothing, despite us both living there and her using it as her primary residence for 4 years. Utilities, groceries, household supplies, furniture, streaming services, insurance, car maintenance on the vehicle we shared. Everything came out of my income, while Monica kept her entire salary for herself, spending it on clothes, spa treatments, trips with her girlfriends, and various personal luxuries that had nothing to do with our shared household. When I tried to bring up the topic of splitting expenses more equitably, she would get defensive and emotional, claiming I was being controlling about money and that real partnerships weren't about keeping score of who paid for what. I thought we were a team, Tyler. Why are you suddenly treating this like a business transaction instead of a marriage, she would say, making me feel guilty for even raising the issue of fairness in our financial arrangement that heavily favored her keeping everything she earned while I funded our entire life together. The breaking point came on a Saturday evening in late September when we went to dinner at a nice Italian restaurant in Queen Anne with Monica's sister and her husband, who were visiting from Portland. The meal was expensive, with multiple courses, wine, appetizers, and desserts that Monica enthusiastically ordered without any hesitation or consideration of cost, since she knew she wouldn't be paying. When the bill came, it was $340 for the 4 of us, and I watched Monica's sister and her husband immediately offer to split it, pulling out their credit card to pay their half. Monica smiled and thanked them, then sat there in silence, waiting for me to cover our portion as always, not offering to contribute anything despite having just received her paycheck 2 days earlier. I felt humiliation wash over me as her sister's husband looked at me with barely concealed judgment, clearly wondering why I was paying for a grown woman who had her own income and could contribute to shared expenses. I pulled out my credit card and paid our $170 portion while Monica chatted cheerfully about dessert, completely oblivious or indifferent to the dynamic that was playing out. After Monica's sister and brother-in-law left, I told Monica we needed to talk about the financial arrangement in our marriage because it was becoming unsustainable and deeply unfair. We walked along Queen Anne Avenue toward where we had parked, the Seattle autumn evening cool and damp, and I tried to explain calmly how frustrating it was to pay for absolutely everything while she kept her entire salary for personal spending. I'm not asking you to pay for everything or even half of everything. I'm just asking for some contribution to our shared life, so I'm not the only one funding our household while you spend your whole paycheck on yourself. Monica stopped walking and turned to face me with an expression that was part anger and part something I couldn't quite identify. You make more money than me, Tyler. Significantly more. It makes sense that you would cover more of our expenses based on our income difference. That's how equitable partnerships work. Proportional contribution based on earning capacity, not arbitrary 50-50 splits that ignore reality. Her logic sounded reasonable on the surface, but it completely ignored that she contributed exactly 0% while I covered 100% of shared costs, which wasn't proportional contribution, it was complete financial dependency dressed up as partnership equality. I pointed out that proportional contribution would mean she covered roughly 38% of shared expenses, based on her income being 38% of our combined earnings, but she was currently covering 0%, which was neither proportional nor equitable by any reasonable definition. Monica's face hardened into an expression I had seen before when she felt cornered by logic she couldn't refute with emotional appeals. "Fine, Tyler. If you want to nickel and dime our marriage and track every dollar like some accountant, maybe we need to reconsider whether this relationship is working at all." I thought I married someone generous and loving who wanted to take care of his wife, not someone who would throw spreadsheets at me about restaurant bills and grocery costs. She walked to our car and got in, ending the conversation before we could actually resolve anything, and we drove home in tense silence through the darkening Seattle streets. That night, I lay awake next to Monica, who had already fallen asleep, and I realized with growing clarity that this pattern would never change unless I forced change, and that forcing change might mean ending a marriage that was fundamentally unbalanced in ways that went far beyond just money. The next morning, I made a decision that felt both scary and necessary. I would stop paying for everything and see how Monica responded when forced to actually contribute financially to the life we supposedly shared equally as partners. I opened a separate bank account at a different bank from our shared one that only I had controlled anyway, since Monica never contributed to it, and I started depositing my paycheck there instead of the joint account she had access to for household expenses. I left just enough in the joint account to cover my proportional share of rent and utilities based on our income ratio, approximately 62% of those fixed costs, and I stopped covering groceries, meals out, entertainment, or any discretionary spending that Monica had grown accustomed to me funding entirely. When she asked why I hadn't restocked groceries like usual, I told her calmly that I had bought food for myself, and that she should purchase what she needed for her own meals from her own income. The shock on her face was almost comical, like I had suggested something completely unreasonable rather than just asking her to feed herself like any other adult with a job and income. Monica became increasingly angry over the following week as she encountered the reality of actually having to pay for things herself, instead of relying on my automatic coverage of all shared expenses. She complained bitterly about having to buy her own lunch during work, about not being able to go shopping freely without worrying about her own money, about feeling punished for what she called my sudden obsession with financial scorekeeping. I maintained my boundary calmly, explaining repeatedly that I was simply asking her to contribute proportionally to shared costs and to cover her own personal expenses from her own income. "I'm not punishing you, Monica. I'm just stopping the pattern where I pay for absolutely everything while you keep your entire salary. You make $58,000 a year. That's a decent income that should be enough to cover your share of rent, utilities, food, and your personal spending." "Beat him," she responded with tears and accusations, saying I had changed into someone cold and controlling. But I noticed she never actually addressed the fundamental unfairness of the previous arrangement or acknowledged that her expectation of contributing nothing was unreasonable. The situation escalated when Monica's credit card bill came due 2 weeks into my new boundaries, and she realized she didn't have enough money in her checking account to pay it because she had spent her entire recent paycheck on shopping and personal luxuries without budgeting for actual necessary expenses. She came to me asking for money to cover the $1,800 credit card payment, and when I refused, she exploded with rage I had never seen before in our relationship. What kind of husband lets his wife go into credit card debt and ruins her credit score instead of helping when she needs it? You're being cruel and vindictive, Tyler. This isn't about fairness. This is about punishing me for not being whatever impossible standard you've decided I should meet. I stayed calm despite her anger, pointing out that the credit card debt was from her own discretionary spending on things like clothes, spa treatments, and lunches with friends that had nothing to do with necessary household expenses. I'm not punishing you. I'm just not subsidizing your lifestyle anymore. You have an income that should cover your expenses. If you're in debt, that's because of your spending choices, not because I'm not giving you money. Monica gave me an ultimatum that evening as we sat in our living room with Seattle rain pounding against the windows, her voice cold and calculated in a way that felt like a threat. Either you go back to how things were before and stop this ridiculous financial independence experiment, or I'm leaving and filing for divorce. I didn't sign up for a marriage where I have to worry about money and split bills like we're roommates instead of husband and wife. I looked at her sitting across from me, beautiful and angry, and completely unwilling to see anything wrong with expecting me to fund her entire lifestyle while she kept every dollar she earned, and I realized our marriage had probably been over long before this moment. If you want to divorce me because I won't pay for everything anymore while you contribute nothing, then I guess we should get divorced. I'd rather be alone and financially stable than married to someone who only values me for my income and my willingness to be exploited. She stared at me for a long moment, clearly not having expected me to call her bluff, then stood up and went to our bedroom where she started making phone calls to her friends and family about what a terrible husband I was being. The divorce conversation that had started as Monica's threat became reality over the following days as she consulted with an attorney, and I did the same. Both of us realizing that this marriage couldn't survive once I stopped accepting the fundamentally unbalanced dynamic she required. My attorney reviewed our financial history and told me we had a strong case for a clean separation since we had no children, no shared property besides furniture of minimal value, and kept largely separate finances despite being married. Your wife has been essentially living for free while banking her entire salary for 4 years. She has no grounds to claim spousal support given her own income and the fact that she contributed nothing to the household. This should be straightforward. Vinum, Monica's attorney, apparently told her something different because she came back from her consultation confident that she would get significant spousal support payments based on the lifestyle I had established during our marriage by paying for everything. My lawyer says I'm entitled to maintenance that reflects the standard of living you provided during the marriage, which means you'll be paying me monthly support for years. You should have thought about that before you decided to be cheap and controlling. Her confidence that the legal system would reward her exploitation made me even more determined to fight this fairly, rather than letting her continue benefiting from my income after the marriage ended. The divorce proceedings revealed just how delusional Monica's expectations were, and how little understanding she had of actual family law versus the fantasies her friends had apparently fed her about divorces being lucrative paydays for women. Her attorney presented a demand for $20,500 monthly spousal support for 5 years based on her claim that she had become accustomed to a certain lifestyle during our marriage that my income had supported. My attorney countered with financial records showing that Monica had earned $232,000 over the 4 years of our marriage and had contributed exactly $0 to household expenses, meaning she had kept every penny for personal spending while I funded our entire life. Your client has $232,000 in earnings that she spent entirely on herself, while my client covered 100% of all household costs. She has no basis for claiming financial dependency when she chose not to contribute despite having substantial income of her own. The judge reviewed the evidence during a preliminary hearing at the King County Courthouse in downtown Seattle, and her expression grew increasingly skeptical as Monica's attorney tried to argue that voluntary non-contribution was equivalent to actual financial need. The judge's ruling came swift and definitive during that same hearing, denying Monica's request for spousal support entirely and ordering a clean division of the minimal shared assets we had accumulated. Mrs. Coleman had adequate income throughout this marriage to contribute to household expenses and chose not to. The court does not reward voluntary financial dependency when both parties have earning capacity. Spousal support is denied. Monica's face went pale as the judge continued outlining the division of our used furniture and belongings, essentially giving each of us half of items worth maybe $3,000 total and sending us on our separate ways. The entire divorce was finalized within 4 months of separation, and I walked out of that courthouse feeling lighter than I had in years, free from someone who had viewed our marriage as a financial arrangement where she got to keep all her money while spending all of mine. Monica, meanwhile, was reportedly furious and shocked that the legal system hadn't rewarded her strategy of contributing nothing while expecting everything. I moved out of our Capitol Hill apartment into a smaller one-bedroom place in Fremont that cost $1,650 monthly, and for the first time in 7 years, I was managing my own finances without anyone else draining my resources or expecting me to fund their lifestyle. The difference in my financial situation was dramatic and immediate. Without Monica's non-contributions sucking up all my income, I suddenly had significant money left over each month after covering my own rent, food, and expenses. I started aggressively paying down the credit card debt I had accumulated during the marriage when covering everything for 2 people on one income, and within 6 months I had paid off $8,000 in debt and started building actual savings for the first time since dating Monica. My stress levels dropped, my work performance improved, and I felt genuine happiness and peace living alone in my modest Fremont apartment where I controlled my own space and finances without anyone exploiting my generosity or making me feel guilty for expecting basic fairness and reciprocity. It was during this period of rebuilding and reflection about 6 months after the divorce that I read a book that helped me understand both what I had tolerated and why I had finally found the strength to stop tolerating it. Grit. The Power of Passion and Perseverance by Angela Duckworth was recommended by a therapist I started seeing to process the marriage and understand my own patterns that had allowed the exploitation to continue for so long. One passage struck me with particular force as I read it in my Fremont apartment on a rainy Seattle evening. Enthusiasm is common. Endurance is rare. The quote made me think about how Monica had shown enthusiasm for our relationship when it benefited her financially, but zero endurance when asked to contribute or sacrifice anything for our partnership. She had been enthusiastic about dinners I paid for, vacations I funded, and a lifestyle my income supported. But the moment I asked her to endure the minor discomfort of paying her own way or contributing to shared costs, her enthusiasm evaporated, and she chose divorce over equity. The book's broader message about grit being the combination of passion and perseverance resonated deeply with my experience of finally setting boundaries after years of accepting unfairness. I had endured an unbalanced marriage for 7 years, persevering through mounting frustration and resentment while hoping Monica would eventually change or recognize the inequity of our arrangement. But real grit, I realized, wasn't just enduring bad situations indefinitely. It was having the perseverance to change those situations, even when change was difficult and scary. Leaving that marriage and enforcing financial boundaries that Monica found intolerable had required more courage and persistence than staying in comfortable exploitation ever had. And the book helped me see that sometimes grit means walking away from what's familiar to pursue what's actually sustainable and fair. I had shown enthusiasm for our marriage in the early years, but I had finally developed the endurance and perseverance to demand equity even when it meant ending a relationship I had invested years in building. That growth felt more valuable than any amount of money Monica had cost me during our time together. My life improved dramatically over the year following the divorce as I rebuilt my finances and learned to enjoy my independence without someone constantly draining my resources or making me feel guilty for expecting basic reciprocity. I got promoted at work to senior software developer with a raise to $115,000 annually. And for the first time, that increased income was mine to save, invest, or spend on things I actually wanted rather than automatically going to subsidize someone else's lifestyle. I paid off all my remaining debt, built up an emergency fund of $15,000, started maxing out my retirement contributions, and even began saving for a down payment on a small house or condo somewhere in North Seattle or Ballard where I could build equity instead of paying rent indefinitely. The financial freedom was exhilarating in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, and I realized how much stress and resentment had been weighing on me during the marriage when every paycheck immediately disappeared, covering expenses for 2 people while Monica hoarded her income for herself. Living within my own means and building actual wealth felt empowering and validating in ways that being exploited never could. I also started dating again after about 8 months of being single, approaching new relationships with very different standards and boundaries than I had maintained with Monica. I was upfront on early dates about expecting to split bills or take turns paying, and I paid close attention to how women responded to that expectation as a filter for their values and character. Most women I dated were completely fine with equitable arrangements, and some even insisted on paying their share or treating me occasionally, which felt refreshing and healthy compared to Monica's entitled expectation of never contributing anything. I met someone named Jenna who worked as a teacher in the Seattle public schools, making about $65,000 annually. And what impressed me most about her was how naturally she suggested splitting checks or alternating who paid without any awkwardness or resentment. "I have my own money, and I'm a grown adult. Of course I should pay for my own meals," she said on our third date when I offered to cover dinner and she declined. Her attitude toward financial independence and equity was so different from Monica's that it felt like dating a completely different species of person. Jenna and I dated for about 6 months before the relationship ended amicably due to incompatible long-term goals about children and location, but the experience taught me that healthy partnerships where both people contributed fairly and respected each other's autonomy actually existed and were possible to find. After Jenna, I dated a few other women casually without anything developing into a serious relationship, and I was honestly content being single and financially secure rather than rushing into another partnership just to avoid being alone. My Fremont apartment had become a comfortable space filled with things I actually wanted rather than compromises to accommodate someone else's preferences, and I enjoyed the freedom of making decisions about my time and money without needing to consult or accommodate a partner who contributed nothing while expecting everything. The life I was building as a single person felt more stable and satisfying than my marriage ever had, and I wasn't willing to compromise that stability for anyone who didn't bring genuine partnership and reciprocity to a relationship. It was almost 2 years after the divorce when I ran into Monica unexpectedly at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. The first time I had seen her since signing the final papers at the courthouse. She was sitting alone at a small table looking at her laptop, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater that were nice, but not the designer brands she used to wear constantly during our marriage. I debated leaving before she noticed me, but she looked up and our eyes met before I could escape, and I saw surprise and something that looked like embarrassment cross her face. I walked over because ignoring her felt more awkward than a brief acknowledgement, and she stood up nervously as I approached. "Tyler, hi. I didn't expect to run into you. How have you been?" Her voice carried none of the confidence or entitlement I remembered from our marriage, and she looked tired in a way that suggested life hadn't been easy since our divorce. "I've been doing well, working, saving money, enjoying the city. What about you?" She gestured for me to sit if I wanted, and curiosity about how her life had unfolded made me accept the invitation for a brief conversation. Monica told me she had been struggling financially since the divorce in ways that surprised and somewhat vindicated me, given how confident she had been about her legal entitlement to my continued support. Turns out, when you actually have to pay for rent and food and everything yourself on a $58,000 salary in Seattle, there's not much left over for the lifestyle I was used to when you were covering all the household costs. I had to move to a studio apartment in Northgate that costs $1,400 monthly, and I'm barely making it work even with cutting back on everything. She wasn't asking for sympathy or money, just stating facts about the financial reality she had been insulated from during our marriage when I had subsidized her entire existence while she spent her income freely on luxuries. "I realize now that I took for granted how much you were contributing and how unfair it was that I never paid for anything. I thought I was entitled to that arrangement because you made more money, but I see now that I was just taking advantage of your generosity while refusing to be an actual financial partner." The acknowledgement came 2 years too late to save our marriage, but it was still validating to hear her admit what I had known all along about the fundamental inequity of our relationship. I asked Monica what had prompted this sudden realization about the unfairness of our previous arrangement, and her answer revealed just how completely she had misunderstood both financial reality and partnership dynamics during our marriage. I started dating someone about 6 months after our divorce, a guy who worked in finance and made really good money, over $200,000 a year. I thought it would be like it was with you where he would cover everything, and I could keep my salary for myself, but he insisted on splitting costs proportionally from the very beginning. She laughed bitterly at the memory. He told me on our third date that he expected me to contribute 22% of shared expenses based on my income being 22% of our combined earnings, and he actually tracked it in a spreadsheet to make sure things stayed fair. At first, I thought he was being cheap and controlling like I accused you of being, but after we broke up, I realized he was just treating me like an equal partner with my own financial responsibilities rather than a dependent he needed to support. The irony that she had learned this lesson from someone else after destroying our marriage over the same issue wasn't lost on either of us. She continued explaining how her perspective had shifted through the painful experience of actually managing her own finances without someone subsidizing her lifestyle. When I had to start paying my proportional share with that guy, and then later paying for everything myself after we broke up, I realized how little of my income I had been contributing to our household when we were married. You were covering literally everything while I was spending $4,000 to $5,000 monthly on clothes, restaurants with friends, spa treatments, and random shopping without ever thinking about rent or utilities or groceries because you handled all of that invisibly. She looked genuinely ashamed as she spoke, and I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness that this awareness had come too late to prevent the divorce. I convinced myself during our marriage that you should pay for everything because you made more money, but really I was just being selfish and taking advantage of someone who loved me and was generous enough to let me get away with contributing nothing. I'm sorry, Tyler. You deserved a real partner who shared the financial load fairly, and I failed you completely on that front. The apology was sincere, but it didn't change the fundamental reality that our marriage was over and that her realization had come only after she lost the comfortable arrangement where someone else funded her lifestyle while she kept everything she earned. I appreciate the apology, and I'm glad you've gained some self-awareness about the dynamics that ended our marriage. But I also recognize that you're only seeing this clearly now because you've experienced the consequences of your choices and lost access to the financial arrangement you took for granted. She nodded in acknowledgement, not trying to deny the timing or suggest we should try again. I know, and I'm not asking for anything or suggesting we get back together. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything you said during our marriage about fairness and contribution, and I was wrong to make you feel guilty for expecting basic equity in our partnership. You deserved better than what I gave you, and I hope you found or will find someone who actually appreciates and reciprocates your generosity instead of exploiting it like I did. We talked for another 20 minutes about our respective lives since the divorce, keeping the conversation friendly but distant in a way that acknowledged we were no longer connected beyond shared history. She asked about my work, and I told her about the promotion and my improved financial situation living alone without supporting someone else's lifestyle on top of my own. She seemed genuinely happy for my success while also rueful about what she had lost by refusing to contribute during our marriage. And I left that coffee shop feeling closure I hadn't realized I needed about why the relationship ended and whether I had been unreasonable in my expectations. Seeing Monica struggle with the financial reality she had been insulated from during our marriage validated my decision to enforce boundaries even when it meant ending a relationship I had invested years in maintaining. The life I had built post-divorce was objectively better in every measurable way than the exploitative dynamic we had maintained during our marriage, and her belated recognition of that inequality didn't change my relief at being free from it. I walked back to my Fremont apartment through the characteristic Seattle drizzle that evening, thinking about the entire arc from that first date 7 years ago, when I had automatically picked up the check without question to this chance encounter where Monica finally admitted she had been taking advantage of my generosity all along. The book's message about endurance being rare had proven true in my experience. Monica had shown enthusiasm for our relationship when it required nothing from her, but she couldn't endure the minor discomfort of contributing fairly when I finally demanded equity. Meanwhile, I had endured years of unfairness before finding the grit and perseverance to change the situation by enforcing boundaries even when it meant losing the relationship entirely. That perseverance had led to divorce, financial recovery, personal growth, and ultimately a much better life than I had been living during the marriage, where I was slowly being drained dry while being made to feel selfish for noticing. Monica's stinginess had cost her a marriage to someone who genuinely loved her and would have been a loyal partner if she had just been willing to contribute her fair share instead of hoarding everything for herself while expecting me to fund our entire shared existence. The day everything changed wasn't some dramatic confrontation or shocking discovery. It was the quiet decision to stop accepting unfairness and to value my own financial well-being enough to demand reciprocity, even if it meant being alone. That decision had been the best one I made in the entire relationship, proving that sometimes the most important grit and perseverance is shown not in enduring bad situations, but in having the courage to change them regardless of cost.